The night shift smelled of bleach and whispered secrets. To Liam, it was a sanctuary. He moved through the polished halls of the Sterling Tower, a quiet ghost in a world of glass and steel. He'd worked here for 7 years, ever since the accident, and he'd learned to appreciate the silence, the rhythmic squeak of his mop bucket, the soft hum of the air conditioning. It was a soundscape of solitude, a balm for a heart that had been broken in the loud, unforgiving world outside. He was invisible, and he liked it that way. It was a good place to hide. He kept his head down, his gaze on the floor, and his thoughts buried deep. He was paid to be a janitor, not a person. He was a man of routine. First, the lobby, with its cold marble floor and the towering modern art piece that looked like a tangled knot of chrome. Then the first 10 floors, each a variation on the same theme of empty cubicles and silent computers. Finally, the top floor, the penthouse suite, the domain of Alistair Vance, the reclusive tech mogul. Rumor had it Alistair hadn't left the building in months, not since some scandal had erupted around his company. Liam had seen him once, a fleeting glimpse of a sharp-suited man with a perpetually furrowed brow, stepping out of a private elevator. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a prisoner in his own fortress. Liam felt a strange sense of kinship with him, a man so powerful yet so alone. Tonight, his routine was interrupted. A note was taped to the door of Alistair's private office. Please clean this room thoroughly tonight. Special request. Liam felt a flicker of anxiety. His work was always meticulous, but this request felt different, loaded with a silent demand for perfection. He pushed the heavy door open, the soft click echoing in the vast, dark space. The office was a monument to wealth and power. A floor-to-ceiling window offered a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline. A massive desk of dark mahogany sat in the center of the room, flanked by bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. Yet, despite the opulence, the room felt sterile, lifeless. It was a place for transactions, not for living. Alistair Vance sat alone in his penthouse office, the city lights below a mocking display of life and joy he no longer felt a part of. He held a glass of amber liquid in a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. His face was a mask of cold fury, but his eyes, when they caught the reflection in the window, held a deep, bottomless sadness. He had just finished a phone call with his lawyers, the last link in a chain of legal battles that had cost him millions and left him emotionally bankrupt. The call was a final, brutal confirmation of what he had already known. There was no way to fix his past, no amount of money that could buy back what he had lost. On his desk, a small, framed photo lay face down. With a sudden, explosive burst of rage, he grabbed it, his knuckles turning white as he ripped the photograph from its frame. He tore it in half, then in half again and again, until it was nothing more than a confetti of torn paper and shredded memories. He let the pieces flutter into the trash next to his desk, a silent, final act of surrender. He felt the cold relief of a man who had finally cut out a festering wound, even if the scar would never heal. He just wanted to forget. He wanted to go back to being the man he was before, the man who was too busy building an empire to feel the sting of regret. He was a man of secrets, and his greatest secret was a pain so profound it had hollowed him out. His rage subsided, leaving him empty and alone. He didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until he let it out in a long, shaky sigh. He poured himself another drink, the ice clinking against the glass like a tiny, solemn bell. He looked at the vast, empty room and felt a familiar, crushing loneliness. He had everything a man could want, and nothing that mattered. His life was a lie, built on a foundation of omission and a desperate need for control. He was a prisoner of his own success, and the only escape he knew was through work and denial. As Alistair sat lost in his thoughts, Liam entered, his cartwheels making a soft, rolling sound against the carpet. He began his work with his usual quiet efficiency, polishing the gleaming surface of the desk, his movements methodical and practiced. He went to the trash can beside the desk, a motion so routine he barely registered it. He tilted the can to empty its contents into his larger bag, and a few stray pieces of paper fell onto the floor. Liam stopped, his trained eye catching a flash of color, a snippet of a face, a small fragment of memory. He crouched down, his movements slow and deliberate, and picked up a tiny piece of torn paper. It was an eye, a gentle, smiling eye that was hauntingly familiar. His breath hitched. It was the eye of his late wife. He picked up another piece, and another, his heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The torn fragments, when pieced together, formed a face he knew better than his own. He stood there, frozen, the crumpled scraps in his hand. He looked at Alistair Vance, the man who had torn the photo, and a question, heavy with disbelief, formed in his mind. It couldn't be. Not her. Not him. The air in the room, once so silent and clean, now felt thick with an unasked question and an unspoken secret. It was the first time in 7 years that Liam had felt something other than numbness. It was the first time in 7 years that he had a reason to look up. He stood there, a small, trembling man in the center of an enormous room. The crumpled pieces of the photograph felt like a live wire in his hands, buzzed with an energy that was both familiar and terrifying. He looked down at them, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. A sliver of her chin, a corner of her mouth, the curve of her eye, all so impossibly real, so achingly recognizable. He had spent 7 years trying to erase her from his thoughts, to bury her memory beneath the quiet, repetitive motions of his job. And here she was, in the trash of a man who owned the city. Liam looked from the paper at Alistair, who was now staring out the window, his back to him. The powerful man was lost in his own private torment, unaware of the explosive truth Liam held in his trembling hands. The irony was a physical weight. Alistair, with his billions and his impenetrable fortress of a building, had discarded the very thing that was both Liam's greatest pain and his last link to a life he had lost. Liam felt the floor sway beneath him. It wasn't just a photograph. He knew every line of her face, every expression, every smile. This wasn't some random woman who looked like her. This was his wife, Clara. But the picture didn't show her as he remembered her. She looked younger, her smile wider, less burdened. And beside her, what was that torn-out space? A child. A child's face was missing. He knelt down, his knees cracking against the hard floor, and meticulously began to piece together the remaining fragments. He found a piece of a tiny hand, then a shock of dark hair. Then the realization hit him like a physical blow. The missing piece. It wasn't just any child. It was the face of his own daughter, Lily. But Lily had been an only child. She had died with Clara. Liam's mind reeled, trying to make sense of the impossibility. He saw his daughter's eyes in the photograph, her mischievous little smile, and then a tear ripped from his own eye, blurring his vision. The tear landed on the torn photograph, a single drop of liquid grief on a paper memory. He remembered every moment of that last day, the sunny afternoon, the hurried phone call, the screech of tires, the silence that followed. He remembered the doctors telling him there was no chance, that his wife and daughter were gone. He remembered the funeral, the empty house, the crushing weight of a life without them. He had believed it, had lived it for 7 years. He had built a life of quiet nothingness to cope with the absolute emptiness. But this photograph, it suggested a different story. It suggested a different life. A life he never knew about. A life that had belonged to Alistair Vance. He looked up at the man, a stranger who was both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. Alistair was still at the window, a statue of regret, his private world as incomprehensible as the vast, star-strewn sky. Liam's mind was a maelstrom of questions. Who was the child? A twin? An older sibling? Why was Clara with this man? A lover? A secret wife? The pieces didn't fit, and the space between what he knew and what this photograph suggested was a chasm of pain. He gathered the scraps of the photo, his hand shaking, and tucked them carefully into his pocket. He continued his work, but his movements were no longer methodical. They were mechanical, a hollow imitation of his former routine. He felt Alistair's eyes on him for a brief moment as he worked, a quick, dismissive glance. It was a glance of a man looking at a shadow, a ghost. But Liam was no longer a ghost. He was a man with a secret, and the secret belonged to a man who saw him as invisible. He finished the job and quietly left the room, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He felt a desperate need to get out, to breathe. As he walked down the hall, away from Alistair's penthouse, he realized the hum of the air conditioning and the squeak of his mop bucket no longer soothed him. They were just noise now, a background to the thunderous storm of his own thoughts. He walked past the security guard at the front desk, but the man, as usual, didn't even look up. To him, Liam was just part of the furniture, part of the building's machinery. But tonight, for the first time, Liam didn't care. His invisible life had just been shattered by a truth so monumental it threatened to consume him. He got into his rusted-out truck and drove aimlessly through the city streets. He drove past the park where he and Clara used to take Lily. He drove past the house they had lived in, which now belonged to a different family. Every memory was now tainted by this new, impossible information. Had she been lying to him? Had she lived a double life? The thought was a fresh, agonizing pain, layered on top of the old, familiar grief. He felt a terrible loneliness, not just for what he had lost, but for what he had never had, a true understanding of his wife and the life she led. He parked on a quiet street and pulled a torn photo from his pocket. The moon, a pale sliver in the dark sky, cast a dim light on the fragmented pieces. He held them together, and the face of his wife stared back at him, her smile a mystery, her life a lie. He saw the torn face of the child again, a small, dark-haired girl. And in that moment, a new emotion, cold and sharp, replaced his grief, a burning need for answers. He couldn't go on living a life built on a foundation of falsehood. He had to know the truth. He had to face Alistair Vance, the man who had the power to answer the haunting question that had just been dropped, like a bomb, into the silent ruins of his life. This discovery is a major turning point for Liam, isn't it? He's gone from a man who wanted to be invisible to a man with an undeniable need for answers. The next morning, Liam's world was a blur of fluorescent lights and muffled sound. He went through the motions of his routine at home, making coffee, staring at the chipped mug, walking past the empty chair at the kitchen table. But his mind was a battlefield. The photograph, now carefully spread out on his small desk, felt like a balm he brought into his quiet life. He stared at the face of his wife, Clara, her smile a cruel riddle. The jagged tear where his daughter's face should be was a physical manifestation of his own torn-up reality. He found himself thinking about Alistair Vance, not as a remote, powerful figure, but as a person tied to his deepest pain. The thought was unbearable. He had two choices. He could destroy the photograph and pretend he had never seen it. He could go back to being an invisible janitor, back to his life of quiet, predictable grief. The idea was a siren song of safety. It was what he had been doing for 7 years. He had perfected the art of avoidance. But every time he reached for the photo to shred it, his hand froze. The weight of the unspoken truth, the potential for a different reality, was heavier than the comfort of his lie. The second choice was a leap into a frightening unknown. It meant confronting the man who held the key to a secret that could shatter everything he thought he knew about his past. It meant giving up his anonymity. He felt a profound sense of fear, not of Alistair, but the truth itself. Could he handle what he might find? What if Clara had left him for Alistair? What if their love had been a lie? Meanwhile, 1,000 feet above him, in the glass fortress of the Stirling Tower, Alistair was in the grip of a cold, silent panic. He had awoken with a familiar dread, a feeling he hadn't had in years. The memory of ripping up the photograph returned with a gut-wrenching force. He had done it in a fit of rage, an act of finality. But what if he hadn't picked up all the pieces? He had told his assistant, a young woman named Chloe, that he needed the room cleaned meticulously. He had sent the note himself. He knew who cleaned the penthouse. A man named Liam. A ghost. He never saw him, but he knew his name from the employee roster. The thought of this man, this stranger, holding a piece of his most painful secret was an agony he couldn't bear. He sat at his desk, staring at the empty trash can. The feeling of being exposed, of losing control, was a foreign sensation that twisted his stomach into knots. He tried to rationalize it. It was just a photo. A janitor wouldn't understand its significance. He would just see a piece of trash and throw it away. But a cold voice in the back of his mind told him he was wrong. He had seen the way Liam had paused, the way his shoulders had tensed. There was something in his stillness that had felt too significant to be accidental. Alistair's paranoia began to build. He started to believe that the janitor had seen something. Perhaps he even knew something. But how could he? He couldn't. It was impossible. He tried to bear the feeling under work, a flurry of emails and phone calls. But his mind kept returning to the image of the man kneeling on his floor, a quiet figure in a suit of grief. The tension between them, though they were miles apart, was palpable. Alistair considered sending someone to find out if the janitor had seen anything. He considered offering him a promotion or a bonus, a way to buy his silence before the secret could even be spoken. But that would confirm his fear. That would be an admission of guilt. He had built his empire on a foundation of control and meticulous planning. He didn't react. He strategized. And his strategy for dealing with the ghosts of his past had always been to bury them deeper. But this one had found a way to the surface, carried by the most unlikely person. Liam, meanwhile, was fighting his own internal battle. He had a shift tonight. Should he go, or should he call in sick? He felt a desperate need to return to the tower, not to clean, but to see Alistair again, to stand in the same room as the man who held a key to his past. The truth felt like a physical magnet, pulling him back. But the fear of what that truth might be was a powerful repellent. He was caught in a tug-of-war between his need for closure and his desire to remain in the safe, numb world he had built. He didn't want a confrontation. He didn't want money or pity. He just wanted to know. He wanted to know if the last 7 years had been a lie. He wanted to know what had happened to the second child, the one who had his daughter's eyes, the one he never knew existed. This push and pull, the internal conflict, was exhausting. Liam finally decided to go to work, not to confront Alistair, but to test the waters, to see if the powerful man would acknowledge him, even in the smallest way. He needed to know if Alistair was as rattled by the incident as he was. He was hoping for a sign, any sign, that this was more than just a coincidence. He had the photograph, and Alistair had the truth. They were bound together by a silent, painful secret, and a new, terrifying part of him wanted to know what would happen when he finally broke the silence. The humid night air in the Stirling Tower felt unusually heavy. Liam, back on his shift, found himself unable to maintain his usual invisibility. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, and every echo in the vast, empty halls sounded like his own name being called. He moved with a forced calm, his hands meticulously polishing surfaces, but his mind was a whirlwind of anxieties. He kept expecting Alistair to appear, to say something, to do anything to betray his awareness of the photograph. But the penthouse office remained dark and silent, a tomb of unanswered questions. Liam, unable to bear the quiet, found a new project, organizing the storage room on the floor below the penthouse, a task that demanded enough focus to keep his mind from unraveling. Upstairs, Alistair sat in the dark, watching the city lights. He had been unable to leave the building, unable to go home, paralyzed by the fear that the secret he'd so carefully buried was now in the hands of a stranger. He had tried to calm himself, to reason that it was just a piece of paper, but the image of the janitor, Liam, picking it up was seared into his memory. He replayed the moment over and over, his mind trying to find a way to spin the event into something harmless. He had considered calling security, fabricating a reason to fire the man, but that felt too risky, too obvious. He was a man who planned his every move, and for the first time in years, he had no plan. He was a creature of control, and right now, control was the one thing he didn't have. He was haunted by the possibility that Liam knew something, that their paths were somehow connected beyond the sterile confines of the tower. Suddenly, a piercing, blaring alarm shrieked through the silence. A high-pitched voice from the intercom announced, "Attention, attention. A fire has been detected on floor 43. Please evacuate the building immediately." Alistair sprang to his feet, a jolt of adrenaline cutting through his paranoia. Floor 43 was 2 stories below him. He ran to the elevator, but the doors wouldn't open. The system was locked down. He looked at the fire escape, a long, winding staircase that seemed to stretch into an infinite abyss below him. He was trapped. He picked up his phone to call for an update, but the lines were dead. The fire, he knew, was likely a false alarm or a minor incident, but the protocol was absolute. He had to get out. He reluctantly began his descent down the fire escape, the rhythmic clang of his shoes on the metal stairs echoing his growing frustration. As Liam heard the alarm, his instincts kicked in. He knew the building's layout better than anyone. He grabbed the emergency flashlight and made his way to the stairwell, his heart pounding in his chest. He was on floor 42, just below Alistair's penthouse. He moved quickly, his mind focused on the protocol. The stairwell was an unlit void, a strange, eerie contrast to the tower's usual light. He was halfway down when he heard a noise above him, a frantic, heavy footfall. He stopped, aiming his flashlight upward, and caught the sight of a man in a rumpled suit, his face etched with a strange mix of panic and exhaustion. It was Alistair Vance. "Sir," Liam said, his voice a quiet question in the loud, metallic space. Alistair froze, his hand on the railing. He looked down, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the janitor from his office. The coldness returned to his face, a mask of superiority and suspicion. "Who are you?" he demanded, even though he knew the answer. "Liam," he replied, his voice calm. "I work on the night shift." Alistair descended a few more steps, his eyes scanning Liam as if searching for something he had lost. The silence between them was loaded. They were 2 men from different worlds, trapped in a single, confining space. "The elevators are down," Alistair said. The word sounded more like an accusation than an observation. "I know. Protocol," Liam replied. "We should wait here. They'll have a team up here soon." Alistair scoffed. "Wait? I don't wait." He looked past Liam, as if he could will the door to open. He was a man used to getting his way, to dictating the terms of every interaction. But here, in this dark stairwell, he was just another person caught in a system beyond his control. "They'll have the fire under control," Liam said. He wasn't trying to reassure him. He was just stating a fact. The best place to be is in a controlled environment. The security office, probably. Alistair looked at him, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He had been so intent on his own worries that he hadn't considered the perspective of the man in front of him. Liam wasn't just an employee. He was a guide in this dark, confusing moment. He led Alistair down the stairs and into a small, cramped room on the 40th floor. It was a security office, A tiny space filled with blinking lights, monitors, and the smell of stale coffee. A single security guard, a young man named Ken, sat at a desk, looking bored. "There you are," Ken said to Liam, relief in his voice. "I figured you'd be in the storage room." Alistair's eyes darted to the janitor. He was not a ghost, not a shadow. He was a person, known by name, trusted by others. The thought was strangely unsettling. They sat in the small room, the three of them, a billionaire, a janitor, and a security guard. A strange, temporary ecosystem of social divides. The weight was agonizing. Alistair was silent, but his agitation was a palpable presence in the room. He kept looking at Liam, his gaze probing, suspicious, as if trying to uncover the answer to a question he was too afraid to ask. And Liam, for his part, kept his eyes on the monitors, trying to hide the fact that he was holding his breath. The forced proximity was an emotional pressure cooker. They were side by side, yet a chasm of unspoken secrets and social status lay between them. They were finally in the same room, no longer separated by their roles, but by their silent fears. For the first time, Alistair was seeing Liam not as a function, but as a person, and Liam was seeing Alistair not as a god, but as a man who was just as afraid as he was. The fire alarm was eventually revealed to be a false alarm, a small kitchen fire on a lower floor. The air was cleared, and the all-clear was given. The security guard, Ken, went back to his desk, relieved. But the shared experience in the small, cramped room had shattered the invisible wall that stood between Alistair and Liam. Alistair stood in the hallway, adjusting his tie with a meticulous, nervous energy. "Well," he said, his voice clipped and businesslike, "I suppose I should thank you." He extended a hand toward Liam, a gesture so unnatural it was almost comical. Liam took it. "Just protocol," he said simply. He saw the flicker of something in Alistair's eyes, a mix of relief and suspicion. The fire alarm had brought them together, but it hadn't erased the secret that lay between them. "You're a quiet man," Alistair said, his gaze probing. "I've never seen you before." "I work the night shift," Liam replied, his hands in his pockets. "Most people don't." Alistair fell silent, the moment stretching into a chasm of unspoken words. The conversation was a dance of subtext. Alistair wanted to know if Liam had seen the photograph. Liam wanted to know why he had it. The air was thick with questions neither of them dared to ask. Finally, Liam broke the silence. He pulled a crumpled napkin from his pocket, the one he had used to wipe down a coffee machine earlier. "I was just thinking about a memory from a long time ago. My wife, she loved coffee shops. Always insisted on making her own." He was testing the waters, throwing out a small, seemingly insignificant detail to see if it would land. Alistair looked at the napkin, his mind immediately turning to the ripped photograph. He saw a connection where there was none, his paranoia seized on the word wife. "Did you lose her?" he asked, the question laced with sudden, uncharacteristic softness. Liam nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. 7 years ago. An accident. Her and our daughter." His voice broke on the last word, the old pain of fresh, raw wound. "I'm still not used to the quiet." Alistair took a step back, the shock on his face undeniable. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He remembered the call from the private investigator he had hired years ago, the one who had told him that the woman, the one he had lost, had been in a fatal car accident. He had felt a moment of cold relief, a sense of finality. He had believed it was over. But the investigator had mentioned only one victim, the mother. He had never mentioned the daughter. Alistair had never asked. He didn't want to know. I'm sorry to hear that," Alistair said, the words hollow. He looked at Liam, a new kind of terror dawning on his face. This wasn't a stranger with a secret. This was a man whose past was entangled with his own. He was staring at the husband of the woman he had once loved, the father of a child he had never met. The guilt he had so carefully buried now rose like a tide, threatening to drown him. A flashback, sharp and vivid, seared through Alistair's mind. He was 25, a ruthless, ambitious young man, more interested in building his company than building a family. He had met Clara at a conference, a brilliant young engineer with a mind as sharp as his own. They had a whirlwind romance, a passionate affair built on late-night conversations and stolen moments. But Alistair had been too selfish, too consumed by his work, to see the person in front of him. When she told him she was pregnant, he panicked. He had offered her money, anything to make the problem go away. She had refused, her eyes filled with a pain that he had only now come to understand. She had left, disappearing from his life and taking a part of his soul with her. A year later, he found out she had had twins. He had never dared to look for them. He had been a coward, a man who believed money could fix any problem, even the problem of his own heartlessness. He had convinced himself she was better off without him. He looked at Liam, the quiet janitor, and the pieces began to click into place. The photograph he had ripped up, the missing child's face, the fact that Liam had lost his wife and his daughter in a car accident, a daughter who would have been the same age as his own, the second twin, the one he had tried to erase from his memory. Liam, a man of simple means, had been the one to give her the family she deserved, the one to love her. And he, Alistair Vance, the billionaire, had been the one who had abandoned them. He felt a deep, profound sense of shame. He was a man who had built an empire, but had failed at the one thing that truly mattered. He had lost his son, the son he had never had the courage to meet. And in the process, he had caused the death of the only woman he had ever truly loved. He realized Liam wasn't a threat. He was a ghost from his past, a living reminder of the man he had been, and the man he was trying to forget. The mystery was gone. The truth was far more painful than any lie. I knew your wife, Alistair said, the words a raw, painful admission, a long time ago, before she was with you. Liam's face went white. The two men stood there, the distance between them gone, replaced by a shared tragedy. Liam's grief, once a solitary burden, was now a shared space, a testament to a truth so painful it had the power to either destroy them or, in some impossible way, bring them together. The air between them was thick with a truth, so heavy it felt like a physical presence. Liam's initial shock was a blank slate, a numbness that held rage and sorrow at bay. He looked at Alistair, the man who had everything, and saw not a billionaire, but a person with a shared wound. The silence stretched, a testament to the weight of the moment. You knew her? Liam finally whispered, the words barely audible. How? Alistair looked away, his eyes fixed on the city lights below, which now seemed to mock his hollow victory. He wasn't a hero in this story. He was a coward who had built a wall around himself to avoid the consequences of his actions. Years ago, he began, his voice raspy. Before your time. She was brilliant. We worked on a project together. There was an understanding between us. We were young, ambitious, and blinded by it. He paused, searching for the right words, for a way to explain the unexplainable. When she told me about the baby, I panicked. I was building my company. I saw it as a distraction. I offered her money, anything she wanted, to make it go away. Alistair flinched as he saw the hurt and confusion on Liam's face. He knew his words sounded cold, devoid of human feeling, but they were the truth. She refused. She said she wanted a real life, not a transaction. She left, and I let her. I convinced myself she was better off without me, that I wasn't capable of being a father. Liam's face crumpled with new kind of pain. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was betrayal. A son, he asked, his voice shaking. You mean a daughter. Alistair's head snapped up. No, a son, he said. The private investigator told me she had twins, a boy and a girl. He said the girl died in an accident with Clara. I never asked about the boy. I just wanted to believe that the last link to my past was gone. Liam felt a fresh wave of grief and confusion. A son, his daughter Lily, had a twin brother he never knew about. He thought about the photograph, the torn-out face of the child. It was the face of a little girl, his daughter. He was holding the evidence of a lie that had kept him from a whole part of his life. I don't believe you, Liam said, his voice hard. The photograph, it was torn out. The face of my daughter. She was a little girl. Alistair looked at him, his heart in his throat. He saw the tears welling in Liam's eyes, the profound sadness that had become a part of him. I didn't tear it out, Alistair said, his voice breaking. That was my son. My son's face was torn out. That was a different photograph. A different time. He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling, and scrolled through a series of old, forgotten photographs. He found one and handed it to Liam. It was a photograph of a woman with a kind smile, holding two infants. One was a little girl, with his daughter's mischievous eyes. The other was a little boy. Liam's eyes blurred with tears as he saw the boy's face, a face he had never seen before, but that felt as if he had always known it. The boy had his wife's nose, his daughter's chin. He was a perfect blend of the family he had lost and the family he never had. He's been missing since the accident, Alistair said, his voice quiet. I thought he was gone. I had been told that he had been in the car with Clara and that they both died. I was told there was no surviving family. Liam sat down on a nearby chair, the full weight of the truth finally hitting him. He had been lied to, not by Alistair, but by someone else, someone who had wanted him to believe that his daughter was the only victim. And Alistair, in his arrogance and fear, had never asked the right questions. He had just accepted the lie. We both lost a family, Liam said, the words a raw confession. We just didn't know it. Alistair nodded, his eyes filled with a fresh wave of tears. I am so sorry, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I am so sorry. The apology wasn't for tearing up the photograph or for the lie, but for the years of pain they had both endured, alone. The shared moment of grief and understanding was a powerful balm. The tension that had defined their relationship evaporated, replaced by a fragile, tentative bond. They sat in silence for a long time. Two men who had been strangers, now connected by a shared, heartbreaking secret. They had both been living a half-life, a life of sorrow and regret. And now, for the first time, they had a chance to start over together. Let me help you, Alistair said, a quiet urgency in his voice. Let me help you find him. Liam looked at him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. He had been so alone in his grief for so long. The thought of a partner in this impossible journey was a light in the darkness. Let's find our son, he said, the words of promise. The next few days were a blur of frenzied activity and shared purpose. Alistair, a man used to delegating, threw himself into the search for his son with a desperate, all-consuming energy. He hired a new team of private investigators, the best money could buy, and pored over old reports with Liam by his side. They worked out Alistair's penthouse office, the sterile room now transformed into a makeshift command center. Stacks of papers and old case files replaced the polished, empty surfaces. For the first time in years, Liam felt a sense of purpose beyond the quiet solitude of his job. He was a partner in this impossible mission, no longer just a ghost in the background. He brought a different perspective, a more grounded, human touch. While Alistair focused on the logistical and financial aspects, Liam focused on emotional ones. He looked at the old photographs of his wife and son, a new, heartbreaking sadness in his heart. but also a growing sense of hope. He shared small, intimate details about Clara, her laugh, her habit of humming when she was happy, the way she would get a single stubborn strand of hair out of her face. These stories were a revelation to Alistair, who had only ever known her as a fierce intellect and a source of regret. Their bond grew, fragile but real, forged in the crucible of a shared mission. They ate takeout pizza at Alistair's massive mahogany desk, their conversations shifting from the search to their own lives, their pasts, their fears. Alistair learned about Liam's life, about the small, quiet joys he found in the simple act of living. Liam, in turn, saw past the layers of wealth and power to the deeply lonely, guilt-ridden man underneath. It felt like healing was possible, that their shared sorrow could become a bridge to a new kind of family. Then came the shattering phone call. One of the new investigators had found a lead. He had located the boy's adoptive family in a small, quiet town 2 states away. He had also uncovered a painful truth about Clara's death. She had been on her way to a meeting with Alistair's family lawyer when the accident happened, a meeting arranged by a high-ranking member of Alistair's company to finalize a custody agreement. The same lawyer who had told Alistair that his son had died. It was a lie, orchestrated by someone who had been paid to make the problem go away. Alistair's face went white. He knew the name of the man who had arranged it. His own father, a man who had always viewed family as a weakness and who had been obsessed with Alistair's rise to power. His father had seen Clara and their son as a liability, a threat to Alistair's carefully orchestrated path to billionaire status. He had engineered the whole thing. The lie, the cover-up, the finality that Alistair had so readily accepted. Alistair's face hardened, his grief twisting into a cold, terrifying rage. He slammed his phone down on the desk, his eyes burning with a fury Liam had never seen. "My father," he said, the words a guttural growl. "He's the one who lied. He paid the lawyers. He arranged it all." Liam, still processing the shock, felt a wave of nausea. "He lied to you? Why?" "To protect his empire," Alistair spat, his voice laced with venom. "To make sure I didn't get distracted by a family. He saw you and your wife as a liability, a threat to his grand plan for me." Liam took a step back, the fragile bond they had built crumbling under the weight of this new revelation. Alistair's father, the same man who had orchestrated the lie that had caused him 7 years of pain. He looked at Alistair, his anger boiling over. "You knew," he shouted, the words laced with accusation. "You knew your father was capable of this. You always knew he was a ruthless monster. But you never questioned it, did you? You just accepted the lie because it was easier than facing the truth." Alistair flinched as if struck. "I didn't know," he yelled back, his voice raw with hurt. "I trusted him. He was my father. And I trusted you," Liam retorted, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and heartbreak. "I thought you were a good man who made a mistake. But you're not. You're just a product of a cold, heartless family who sees human lives as commodity. You're just like them." He pointed a trembling finger at Alistair. "The only reason you care now is because it's your son. You didn't care about my family. You didn't care about the truth until it became your problem." The words, sharp and full of truth, sliced through Alistair. He stood frozen, his face a mask of wounded silence. Liam's accusation was a dagger to his heart because he knew it was true, in a way. He had accepted his father's lie because it was the path of least resistance. He had avoided facing his own guilt by believing the lie. He looked at Liam, the man who had shown him what it meant to grieve, to feel, and he saw only a stranger again, a stranger whose family he had helped to destroy. "I can't do this," Liam said, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper. He turned and walked away, leaving Alistair standing alone in his penthouse, surrounded by the ruins of a shared truth and a shattered bond. The silence that followed was more painful than any shout. The one person who had truly seen him, who had connected with him, was gone, and it was all because of the lie he had been too afraid to question. Liam's apartment, once a sanctuary of quiet solitude, now felt like a cage. He sat on his threadbare couch, the torn photograph from Alistair's trash in one hand, the new photograph of his wife and their 2 children in the other. He stared at the 2 images, a physical representation of the 2 lives he had lived. One a life of solitary grief, the other a life of painful, complicated truth. The rage he had felt when he left Alistair's office had faded, leaving behind a deep, aching sense of betrayal. It wasn't just Alistair's father who had lied. It was Alistair himself who had been too afraid to face the truth. He had taken the path of least resistance, and in doing so had robbed Liam of 7 years of a son he didn't even know existed. He considered his options, though in his heart he knew there was only one. He could walk away. He could go back to his simple, anonymous life, bury the photographs, and pretend he never found them. He could let Alistair deal with the consequences of his own cowardice. The thought it was tempting. It was an easy way out. But a quiet, insistent voice in the back of his mind wouldn't let him. It was the voice of his daughter, of his wife, of the son he had yet to meet. They deserved the truth. They deserved a family. And he, Liam, was the only one who could make that happen. Meanwhile, in his silent penthouse, Alistair was drowning in a sea of regret. He stood at his window, the city lights below a cold and unforgiving ocean. Liam's words, "You're just like them," echoed in his head, each word a hammer blow to his carefully constructed facade. He had always believed he was different from his father, that his ambition was a testament to his own strength, not a reflection of his family's heartless nature. But Liam's words had exposed the truth. He had been just as selfish, just as cowardly. He had chosen to believe a lie, because it was easier than confronting a painful truth. He had chosen to be alone. He looked at the empty room, the scattered case files and coffee cups, the lingering scent of takeout pizza. It was a monument to the fragile bond they had built, and he had destroyed it. He had a choice to make. He could let Liam walk away and go back to his life of immense wealth and profound emptiness, or he could face his own demons, humble himself, and try to salvage the one true connection he had made in years. The path of pride was familiar, well-trodden. The path of vulnerability was a terrifying, unknown road. Alistair looked at his phone, his finger hovering over Liam's number. He wanted to call, to beg for forgiveness, but the words felt too big, too unwieldy. He knew he couldn't just apologize. He had to show Liam that he was different, that he was willing to fight for their shared connection, for their son, no matter the cost. He made a decision. He would go to Liam. He would face the man he had wronged, and he would not leave until he had a chance to make things right. At the same moment, Liam was making his own choice. He couldn't go back to his old life. The silence that had once comforted him now felt like a suffocating blanket. He knew that for his own sake, and for the sake of his son, he had to try. He had to fight for the family that had been stolen from him. He couldn't let Alistair's betrayal be the end of the story. He had to see if there was a possibility of a new beginning. He picked up his keys, a quiet resolve settling over him. He would go to Alistair. He would demand a real conversation, a raw, honest reckoning, not for revenge, but for the truth. The reunion happened not in Alistair's grand penthouse, but in a small, sterile conference room on a lower floor. Liam had arrived first, a quiet and determined presence. A few minutes later, Alistair walked in his suit, rumpled, his face etched with exhaustion and humility. The power dynamic had shifted. Alistair was no longer the all-powerful billionaire. He was just a man, vulnerable and exposed. He sat across from Liam, a quiet apology in his eyes. He didn't offer a handshake or a formal greeting. Instead, he pulled a photograph from his briefcase. It was the one he had ripped up. The edges were taped together with a clear, almost invisible tape. The image, once so fragmented and torn, was whole again. It was a picture of Clara, smiling, with a little boy's face carefully taped back into place. "This is our son, Liam," he said, his voice quiet and filled with emotion. "I had the pieces scanned and restored. I needed to see him, to remember him." He pushed the photograph across the table, a silent offering, a gesture of peace and a promise of a shared future. Liam looked at the photograph, his eyes blurring with tears. He saw the face of his wife and the face of his son, a son he never knew existed. He saw his daughter's eyes, a cruel echo of a past he had so painstakingly buried. But now, in the stillness of the room, he saw something else, a future. He saw a chance for a new kind of family, a chance to finally heal the wounds of his past. "I'm sorry," Alistair said, the words a raw confession. "I'm sorry for everything. I was a coward. I let my father lie to me because it was easier than facing the truth of what I had done. I let my fear of vulnerability keep me from my son, and it almost kept me from you. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for a chance to be a father, a chance to be a better man, a chance to find our son together." Liam looked at Alistair, the man who had been a ghost, a rival, a confidant, and a betrayer. He saw a man who was no longer hiding behind his money or his power. He saw a man who was just as broken as he was, a man who was finally willing to face his own pain. He reached across the table and picked up the photograph, his hands no longer trembling. "He's our son," Liam said, the words a quiet promise, a shared truth. "We'll find him." They began to work, not as enemies, but as partners. Alistair used his resources, and Liam provided the heart and emotional intelligence. They found the adoptive family. A meeting was arranged. The woman who had adopted their son, a kind-hearted nurse named Lena, had known about the twins. She had been a friend of Clara's. When she heard about the accident, she knew she had to save the boy. She had taken him, and with the help of a family friend who had also been Alistair's private investigator, she had faked his death to protect him from Alistair's father. She hadn't known the investigator was lying to Alistair. She had just wanted to keep the boy safe. They met the boy, a kind, intelligent young man named Adam, in a bustling park, a stark contrast to the sterile, silent tower where their journey had begun. Adam, now a teenager, looked at them with a mix of curiosity and confusion. He had a familiar sadness in his eyes, a feeling of not quite belonging. He had always felt a piece of himself was missing, and now he understood why. He looked from Alistair to Liam and back again. The two men, a billionaire and a janitor, were his fathers. The story ends not with a grand reunion or a triumphant victory, but with a simple, quiet moment of connection. Alistair, the man who had been a prisoner of his own wealth, finally found a family. Liam, the man who had been a ghost of his own grief, found a new reason to live. They had lost a family, but they had found a new one. Their love, born from tragedy and forged in truth, was an unexpected gift, a redemption story that began with a torn photograph in a billionaire's trash. The journey for Liam and Alistair was full of unexpected twists and turns, but ultimately led them to a place of healing and love. What do you believe is the most important part of the story about redemption? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more beautiful stories.